Yeah, I mean, that is very true, and I think also this might be a good entry point. Um, um, like two things you mentioned already is um, how do we sort of tell a story, our biography or our history, and the idea that whatever happens to end up in a story or an archive is many times an accident. Like,
Yeah.
I always think that archives are nothing but a series of happy accidents, like, or unhappy ones. Like, it depends which way you look at it. But I think those two questions about once you look back at a series of events, how do you weave them together to create a story, to tell a story, and at the same time, when you look at those events, some of which really look completely random, like how someone ends up in theater or ends up performing or ends up writing, because this was also the case with me. I did not graduate university wanting to write. It just happened that my longest time friend and also someone I worked with a lot, Adham Hafiz, who's an Egyptian director and choreographer, gave me a book by Susan Sontag, Against Interpretation. And I read this and I immediately thought to myself, that's exactly what I want to do. I had no idea how I'm going to do it or if I can do it, but it just gave me a very strong sense of direction. And I randomly wrote a review with really completely random, and I just sent it to one of those English language newspapers in Cairo at the time. And the editor at that particular newspaper liked it and said, I don't understand a lot of what you're doing, but I think it's interesting. You should write more. And this is how it started, really. So a lot of it, once you look back at it, really looks like it was subject to randomness.
Yeah, I find super interesting when you talk about the writing. I think for me, I want to ask you, as someone who writes, sometimes I know kind of remember quite strongly when I started to write, like for myself. I was 11 years old, and I just wrote like diary and whatever, that kind of stuff. And out of a sudden, I had the feeling, and I still have it, because for me it's like there are times where I write a lot. Now at the moment I don't write anything, and I always I felt like then I started to write, and out of a sudden my life was affected by that writing, so that there is a kind of a performativity in writing and in documenting.
Yes.
It was really strong when I had a project with a colleague and friend of mine. We started it in 2020, and we just started it out of a writing practice we wanted to share, and we would share a Google Doc, and each day we would write. Actually, we wanted to start with a sentence, and then it ended up like we always started writing a kind of a little text, and then Corona came, for instance, and it was so interesting because then we had to react on that global situation, or it was kind of magic to see. We initiated a kind of archive, and out of a sudden it always reacted to what was happening and how it was moving us. And I have the there was a project by Johanna Witten and me, because I can say, I don't know. but I have this, if I write for myself as well, and there's this text from by Roland Barthes, Die Lust am Text, where it's described like you write, and then you have the reader, who you have to. There's a tenderness with the text, and also begin mit dem Leser, which you don't know who it is, and I think, yeah, maybe this can be compared also when we talk about archive, because for whom or for what purpose, or what do we project in the future? Who is our audience? Or yeah, I have the feeling whenever you start writing or recording or documenting something, it gives it says that something is von Bedeutung, that something is meaningful in order to protect it. Yeah. So yeah. I would be super curious to what you just said, how this occurs, like the Susan Sontag thing maybe, and your archival project with the encounters that you did. Yeah, maybe you can tell something about it.
Yes. I mean, that's already a lot of food for thought. I do agree that there is a particular relationship that you imagine when you're writing, and when there is this particular sense of documenting or preserving, like a certain sense of a story or an event or a history. So there is that relationship, which I think is very, very intimate between you and the future reader of whatever you write, because whatever you write will always be read in the future. Mm-hmm. The moment it's written, it's never going to be read in the past. It's always that reader that's going to yet to read it. And to me, it's the most intimate of things when I think about it, when I write. I don't think I'm ever as close to anyone than that reader in that particular point when they read what I write. I am in conversation with them. And although I'm naturally someone who's reserved, I'm not at all reserved when I write, because there is something that is truly emancipated in the act of writing. It's like, you know, I don't like this metaphor that Ernest Hemingway used to say, but I think it's very close. You just sit at the typewriter and you start bleeding. It's something that's very intimate and very vulnerable as well. It's an act of extreme vulnerability. So there is that. And there is also a very sort of a sense, almost a sense of responsibility, you know, especially when your writing practice or your archival practice hinges on stories that normally don't get told or don't get to have a space or a voice. And that's sort of, again, an interesting sort of entry point to the encounter project. And it had to do with a particular, again, point in time where this is the golden age of blogging, you know, worldwide. Everyone had a blog. This is the early to mid 2000s. And, you know, this was truly a global phenomenon. So Egypt was no exception. Many blogs in Arabic sort of, you know, had a boom during those years, 2002, 2006, 2007. And some of those very famous activists and writers are now some of the leading voices in Arabic literature now. You know, Ahmed Nagy, who was arrested and now moved to the US, Ala Abdel Fattah, our most famous prisoner of conscience, had a blog during that time, during that golden age of blogs. So there was this desire to create an alternative digital almost platform or space for voices that are outside the mainstream and basically outside the main print press and media in Egypt. And this is where I also started writing my own blog, actually 2 blogs, one about when I shared with you Awkward Sex in the City, sort of a parody on Sex in the City, Carrie Bradshaw, and one that is more geared towards my actual writing, essay writing and reflecting on contemporary art in Egypt. And for both, I was trying to create that critical space, really. Both I had the same mindset and the same sort of tone, but one was more sarcastic than the other. That's it. And to me, the stories of the queer community in Egypt, that rarely gets any airtime. It rarely gets featured. It's usually only seen in the media or the press in contexts that are, criminal or scandalous, and or sort of stigmatized, you never really see any stories about the queer community that are just about the queer experience, not about scandal or disease or social disintegration. And it has to do, of course, with living under an authoritarian government, and it has to do with what I call the politics of distraction. Arab regimes, and not just Egypt, Arab regimes usually always project on the weakest link. They always use the weakest link and mobilize that very, hostile moral outrage towards the weakest link. It's usually women, minorities, people from the queer community. And to me, growing up, I did not grow up, in the aftermath. I grew up in the aftermath of the AIDS pandemic. So this was not part of my history. And for many reasons, this was not also part of the queer experience in Egypt. Not anymore, but when I was growing up, it was not. But what was a big part of our experience are a series of raids and public arrests. So that is part of the queer story that I grew up with. And it's terrifying because, you cannot just define your relationship to society or the state only in terms of fear of persecution or arrest. That's not a very healthy relationship, to say the least. And by writing those parodies on Sex and the City, I was trying to say that, there is another experience of, queer people in Cairo who have fun and and also there is a bit of politics in there. Of course, there's a bit of politics because, you cannot talk about a minority without hitting a political wall. I was very conscious of that. And I just wrote and wrote and wrote, and I never really thought about doing anything with that archive of stories and experiences about, the people in my social circles. I was also really, really conscious about the idea of representation, because I only represent a very particular segment of that community. And this is, of course, affluent, westernized, bourgeois kind of, experience. And this might not be the experience of many other queer people living in Cairo. I represent maybe 15% or 20%. The rest still remains unrepresented. And this was always something that haunts me. And I think haunts any archive of stories, because which stories make it through and which stories don't. And, fast forward many, many years after I started keeping the blog, I got to travel to Belfast to this queer arts festival called Outburst. And there, they were also struggling with erasure of queer experience for different reasons. Not, I mean, for different reasons, because, you know, again, North Ireland, you know, conservative society and all of that, like, you know, patriarchy, the usual mix. And those artists that I met there were super conscious about claiming the city and claiming their space and their place in the city. And I found that very, very moving, you know, the way they decided to approach that by talking to elder members of the community and asking them to share their stories, you know, where they met, where they had parties, where they socialized, what kind of, you know, stories do they have, what kind of experiences, how was it like living in North Ireland in the 70s, for example, as a queer person. And they basically did those illustrations of those characters in different parts of the city of Belfast. Of course, it helps that Belfast is really small. So they, unlike Cairo or Berlin, which is massive. And when I was there for the first time in Belfast at the 2018 edition of the festival, I saw the posters and the postcards, and I spoke to the artist, and I just felt that this is really something I relate to, you know, because of this constant threat of erasure. And it's something that I think a lot about, because you never archive what you know will survive. You only archive what you're sure won't survive, that you know will get erased or might potentially face erasure or forgetfulness. What you know will survive, you never bother to record, because you know it's going to live in some form or the other. The desire to document always implies something is potentially going to be forgotten or is already forgotten. And this is my experience, not just, you know, working with this publication Encounter, where I tried also to show how in different Arab cities, queer communities and communities that are marginalized. For example, one text is by this Jewish Tunisian historian who talks about the experience of being Jew in Tunisia. She's not queer in that sense, but she belongs to a group that was erased from the memory of the city where she grew up in. So those stories I was very keen to include, to again have this moment where you reclaim those spaces and reclaim those experiences that might be seen as foreign or an outsider experience or not truly authentic of that particular city, be it Cairo or Beirut or Tunis or Damascus. And it was very important to me that there are Arab voices. It's not that, you know, someone was writing about their experience visiting Cairo or visiting Beirut, but an actual Beiruti person wrote that story. And yeah, sorry, I spoke too much.
No, it's fine. Maybe coming back to, I find it interesting that you say you would always archive something where you think it might get erased, or that you feel like is in danger to be forgotten. I think this is precisely true for artistic archives or for subvertive practice of archiving. And I'm wondering how you in your experience, what is your, how do you think it's going on with the archive that has this authority that is like an institution from a state, or from, because every state has own archives, or they work like, yeah, separately from other, like from the living experience maybe of people. Or yeah, that's when I think of archives, I think it always like both sides. And what for me, one picture which is very strong in my like family history is the GDR falling apart, and then you have this massive papers that like people from the Stasi were spending like 1 month during night and day shifts to erase the documents. Like that state really collected so much information, and then in the end, when it fell apart, they had to erase it again. So I'm interested in that power dynamics of who is archiving what, for what purpose, and how do we then deal with that information. And yeah, I think in Cairo you have that special situation with the archive of performing arts. Yeah, that I would be curious to hear.
Yeah, I mean, that's also an interesting sort of way to look at existing archives, because when it's not the state that is documenting or gathering archive, then it's usually the impulse to preserve something that is at the threat of being erased or forgotten. But if it is the state that is collecting information, documenting, it's usually for the purpose of control. So I don't think that any state-controlled archive is done just out of the need to organize history, for example. No, it is done out of control. And it has to do with controlling the narrative in the sense of that particular narrative about the nation, the story of that nation, especially in culture or the arts. In Egypt, we have some of the oldest archives in Africa and the Middle East, whether, you know, whether theater, whether dance, whether press, you name it. And I can't imagine any of it being seen or interpreted even by the state itself than an attempt to control and construct a particular story, narrative about the nation, you know, about Egypt as a nation. The problem is that because it is a very bureaucratic process how archiving happens in state archives, there is no curating. So everything is documented. And this where it becomes really interesting, because then you have this multiplicity of voices, things that are so different and so separate are put together in the same archive, under the same umbrella, under the same, for example, fine arts. The fine arts sector has a website and it's open to the public. Anyone can access it. And it has PDF scans of all the catalogs for all the exhibitions that are done in state-owned galleries or art spaces. It goes back to 2008. Anyone can go online and download those catalogs. It's open to the public. But then there is no particular criteria. Every single exhibition that takes place on those premises will be documented. Everything. There is no hierarchy. There is no preference. There's no framework or paradigm by which those documents are organized. And to me, that makes it super interesting, because then you really have this everything but the kitchen sink. Like, you know, you have everything in that archive, but you have no story. You have no sense of it because it's everything that happened. At the same time, I'm always surprised at that desire, that obsessive desire to gather information and, you know, the same way the Stasi was obsessed with gathering information, because there is always that sense that this particular piece of information might lead on to a particular, you know, potential foil, potential conspiracy, you know, like, and same goes in Egypt. Everything is documented, not because for the love of the arts, God forbid, but for the potential that, oh, this is the key to like some kind of subversive action, which is not true at all, of course. There are no subversive actions taking place on state-sponsored or state-run art spaces. So it is that desire I find of control, but that in a particular moment is happy to destroy all this information, you know, because it never really cared about the actual content, you know. It doesn't matter. This exhibition is the same as the other one. It's the same as the one that's going to be showing next week. It's all the same.
So, and then in the end, it's about this authority and about, what you say, control and power. And I think it's so paradox, because you could look at it, or I also know someone who is working in a big archive, who is actually now working in Bürgerbehörde, who is which is the Behörde archiving what the Stasi had done in Berlin. And like, I think the idea is to be neutral and objective in collecting all that information, not doing a hierarchy. But then I think maybe for us, if we say we as like people dealing with theater, like that performativity of how do we then enter the archives? Is it even possible to enter an archive? And the form of how this information is collected does something to the information, to the actual history. So I'm wondering what could be a different way, maybe a more honest way to preserve and to be honest with that, that there is actually always a kind of curatorial moment whenever you look at history, and that it's not possible to collect something, to tell a story without your own involvement and your own interpretation of what happened or what is worth in order to be preserved. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very sort of ongoing kind of process for me, I think. I don't think you ever really resolved at how objective you are, or like if you set a certain criteria when you are trying to archive, or when you're trying to write the story of a certain practice, for example, let's say performing arts or contemporary dance in Egypt the last 20 years. I don't think you really are able to have this absolutely transparent kind of position to it. I think you always come in with a particular vested interest and a particular desire. You know, there is a certain, you know, maybe not necessarily desire that is pragmatic. It can be also something aesthetic, you know, like you have a particular aesthetic desire, and it has to do with your own background, your own history, your own preference. I think what is really important is that you practice that exercise of self-reflection. And when you are, let's say, looking at the practice of, I don't know, 3-4 dancers or choreographers that have worked the past 15 years in Cairo, I give that example because it's an example I know. You then sort of implicate yourself in that story and say that those particular practices speak to me in a certain way because they have worked on such and such, or they have developed a particular artistic process or practice that touches upon such and such. And once you implicate yourself in that story and why you're looking at it the way you are looking at it, you allow others either to identify with you or take a different position and say, I'm not interested at all in that story, you know. And then they go and they try to, like, you know, create counter stories, counter narratives, which I find the most interesting thing about working with archives or working with history, like materials of history, because you have those different ways of telling a story. And of course, sometimes the documents speak for themselves. You know, for example, if I say that the majority of contemporary dance choreographers in the last 20 years were women, that's a fact. I'm not assuming a feminist position here. That's the truth. The majority were women. It's an interesting observation, like why it, and you can say, because wow, we have such an emancipated view of contemporary dance that women were much more inclined to do it. No, that's not true. And here's the counter stories. Here's where counter narratives happen. That the fact is, the number of practitioners at certain points in terms of ratio of gender were more women and less men. The reason behind this can be read in different ways. This can be read as, well, because men view contemporary dance as a woman's dance and they avoid it, while women find that contemporary dance is much more emancipatory in terms of, like, you know, corporality and therefore they feel more compelled to actually develop it as a practice. And those counter narratives, I think, is the tension that is interesting. When you are looking at something that is quasi a fact, you know, like almost a fact.
Yeah, this idea of facts and truth, I think that's that's also the limit when I always come to that limit of thinking of the archive when it reaches that idea of truth or facts or collection or like Vollständigkeit or and I find interesting, and then just a question, it's maybe a question of belief and it refers to what we said before with that coincidence or not, or whatever, or like, do things happen for a reason or not, maybe, or don't, or is it that we don't have a chance to read it differently, that because we are humans we always read and interpret things that they happen for a reason. How do you think are traces of the history, and I would say maybe they are archived differently than in conventional sense of archive. How do you think that these traces are like have a life of themselves, that you put yourself in relation to it? Like, maybe it's a bit confusing. What I want to say is that stories that might be forgotten or that are forgotten, is there a chance that they come to life again, or that they are still there? You know what I mean? Like, and I also say this because you wrote about that disappearance, which I find a super interesting momentum for myself. And there are like theorists that say, or like Rebecca Schneider, I don't know if you know her, she wrote she's a philosopher, I think. She wrote about that a performance always remains, actually, but that our Western sense of remaining or understanding of remaining is just differently. That how can we even say that performance must remain in documents such as text, video, or other forms of documentation? Or isn't it because it's about live art that there are traces that are still with us, and the theater is actually the place where we can, like, where we deal with absence and with ghosts and stories and all that stuff. But yeah, on the other hand, it's, if we would leave it like this, then we would just say, okay, so we don't have a need to archive, we don't have a need to write stories. So yeah, but you know what I mean, like these two angles, and what it's about the disappearing. That was actually my question. So, 5 questions in one. Okay.
I mean, when I wrote that text about disappearing, I really was thinking of it as a queer strategy of survival, you know, because again, there's a particular sense of threat or a particular sense of the need to erase a particular experience of life, of space, of social interactions that happen in a certain way. And it is a particular almost kind of cunning, you know, because in Arabic the word is hila or tahayul, which is a beautiful word that I can't now find an exact translation to, because it is a trick, but it also means to try and appease and to almost ingratiate yourself to someone so that they allow you to exist. So it's a double sense of trickery, but also appeasement, that you try to sort of find a way to communicate with someone, to appeal to their softer, tender side so that they can accept you and, like, you know. And so I was thinking of those two things, that idea of cunning, that you're trying to do something that you should not be doing. And if you're caught, the consequences can be dire. They can be severe. You could get killed. So you're trying to be very cunning, but also that you are trying to appeal to something that is softer and, like, you know, that is kinder and that's sort of, you know, empathetic. And I find that really the cornerstone of any queer experience, those twin processes. And you're right. What I meant by disappearing is not just that those stories or those experiences are forgotten, but that they remain within the fabric of people's memories. So the most glaring example is the concert of Warda, you know, the Egyptian Algerian singer who was, you know, one of the, like, divas, icons really of the 70s and 60s and 70s of Arabic pop music. And she dressed like a drag queen. This was not, there's no way of putting it other than this is like a drag aesthetic. And she's a gay icon, of course, and she knew it, people knew it. There is no two way of putting it aside than her being like a gay icon. That remains in people's imagination. That remains when people remember her performing and remember her presence. And the memories of the entire queer community of Warda remain just the same. They leave traces everywhere. So yes, definitely the traces remain. The problem is that sometimes when people look back at those traces, and I also mentioned the film by Atif Tayyib, this also very famous Egyptian director who was part of the New Cinema group in the 80s. who all had this dramatic, super realist shift. And many of his films have this very strong homoerotic, homosocial tendency. Like, there's a very strong homoerotic subtext in many of his films. As a child, even before knowing what homoerotic is, I felt it. And I was not alone. Those experiences that we have of such phenomena, as film or music or performance, I don't think they disappear. It just takes another person experiencing or remembering that, and then it's sort of, it sort of comes back to life. And the act of remembrance, I think, is where this happens. With performance, because it's a live art, whether dance or theater, I think the major difference when it comes to Western notions of the documentary or how to record or dealing with absence or presence is embodiment. I think up till now, I've seen very few actual like performing artists or dancers or people who work with physical theater or TanzArchiv that carry that sense of embodiment beyond the performance. And this is where I think there is that black box of how do we document this and how do we preserve it and so on. I think in improvised, informal practices, body-based practices, and I'm going to use belly dance because the practice I know the most. You embody, you internalize the music, the setting, the choreography, and you carry it with you. And so people remember through their bodies. This is how it's embodied. It's not that I went to a theater and I sat and then I watched and then I stood up and I left. No, I went to a public arena. I saw someone dance and I danced with them. And I went back home, played the same music and danced with my friends and my family. And we internalized this entire experience. And therefore, when I dance again, I'm going to actually literally bring that performance into my body again, live. And I think that's one major difference when you're trying to understand what remains, and I don't.
You're totally right.
Yeah, yeah, and by that I don't mean that some performances don't live in your body. Of course they do, because and sometimes even through a second narration, like I remember Adam Hafiz told me a story about a performance he saw of Vera Montero, and she was doing a piece about Josephine Baker, and of course, because Adam is a dancer and choreographer, he described it in such a moving way that I had the whole piece constructed in my head. And I even timed it. And I remember that particular last scene where she basically it's her trying to imitate Josephine Baker, and then there's play with light and darkness and being like settled and unsettled in your position as a performer, as a performing body. And the way he described it, I could really imagine myself in that sort of performing body. This, of course, can happen, but I don't feel that a lot of the audiences have that position towards what they're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the most powerful and constructed arrangement in Western theater perception, especially in Germany, that you have this passiveness of the audience and that activeness on stage, and you have the idea of the feedback Feedback-Schleife from Erika Fischer-Lichter. She was like a very important, or she is a very important theater scholar, scientist. At the same time, people that are dealing with archive or with even people that are doing dance science, that are journalists, and I cannot say this for everyone, but there is this idea, I think, especially in German culture, that there are the artists, and then there are the other people having like the more rational meta approach to it, and the intellectual approach to it. And sometimes I also find it super funny because, and for me, I think from own like writing experience, by writing reviews for pieces, it's really not true, because when I wrote about a piece that I saw, I also entered again that emotional state that I had watching that show. And I would also say a good text, in my opinion, is also is in that state of vulnerability, because it's you have to actually open your heart or your body, whatever, to be able to describe what happens to you watching a theater piece or a dance piece. But still, I think the major idea is that there are people like having the idea and the opinion and the knowledge about what is happening there physically. And so, and still, it's actually an interesting construction, because I think people are moved and are touched and have feelings to what they see, and to carry it in their bodies also. But if it's not, and I think that's also a Western idea of, if it's not like if it's not written down, if we don't have a proof for it to happen, or a documentation, like a kind of extra thing that that proves something happened, or that proves it is important, then it's actually quite it can disappear quite easily in that mainstream reception of art. It's an interesting point with this embodiment, and I think it also has to do with who and where does art take place, and who is our audience? What is it? For whom are we doing that? I don't know. A very big question, but
I mean, I think for a live art, a live practice, like especially like dance or physical theater or TanzArchiv, I think that it's very difficult not to think of the audience as having this sort of almost immediate kind of, response to it, because it's a moving body right in front of you. I always find it interesting, how do you qualify that experience, and how you're supposed to deal with it if you are in a Western context, instead of thinking it as an experience that is yours to imitate and replicate and mimic, and that sense of ownership creates a very different relationship to what you see. And this is what I think is super interesting, because theater in its very, very early forms, even in Europe, was about talking to the people, like the masses. It was open air, and it's just a makeshift stage, and whether if you look at morality plays or later development into more secular theater, the addressee were always the public. There was something about taking from the public and then sort of doing something with it and then, like, you know, staging it again. So this sort of like feedback, like, you know, loop, that you take something from the people and then they take something from you and they do something with it, with their bodies, like, you know. That part I always found very interesting about theater. However, in most of contemporary theater and dance that I see in Western Europe, there isn't that sense that people can take ownership of what is being done before them as audience. And they can take it and, like, you know, and really embody it and then do something else with it, like, you know. I don't think that happens. I don't think that there is that expectation of the audience. And I think that creates a very different sense to the practice. And I think then there is an immediate need to document it and make sure that it's presented in a particular way, that, you know, that experts write about it, that is properly filmed and all that. So, and this also has to do with the whole economy of production and setup and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And also me, or like us now as two dramaturgs, to make that shift. Yeah, it's interesting because whenever you write an evening program and you print it, and then there's this gap between a description, or even like before, you have to, in order to get money, you have to do an application and you have to prove what you're doing. And it also has, it's a practice that we're doing, but yeah, no, it just happened now for me when I went to Tanz Festival, Rhein-Main, and I saw a piece of Nadia Bucré, which was so moving and so beautiful, and I was just, yeah, really crying. And just because I don't know why, even, you know, and I don't know why, it just, there was something like unconsciously took place there with me and what I saw. And then I looked at the evening program again, and I was like, this text, it's ridiculous. It cannot, you know, it cannot catch what is happening there. And like sometimes I feel like texts, and I say this as a person who loves writing, who loves text, but it also is a failure always to what is happening, or what has happened, or we can find different forms of writing and acknowledge the gaps and that it's not possible to translate something into that idea of transparency or rationalized text forms, or, you know what I mean? So, and this, I think, what kind of approaches and strategies can we find and still be so open? Because what we are trying with those evening programs is, of course, to make it as understandable as we can for a wider audience, and therefore to be like, to try to be not that much subjective. But how can we find actually an intersubjectivity amongst spectators, amongst artists? How can we, what kind of forms aesthetically, documentary-wise, and writing-wise can we find? Yeah, this is maybe, and it's an open question for me still.
Yeah, definitely. that is definitely an open question. I doubt we could like answer that now.
No.
But I think like any displacement of any medium, when you take something from one medium and you like displace it in another, certain things emerge and others get, you know, like submerged. They get sort of, you know, dissipated. They disappear, to use that word again. And same goes when you're using sound and you shift to visual and vice versa. You know, certain things, then it tells you something else about the nature of the practice of what you're doing. And same goes for writing. Writing is a medium and it does something else. Like, you know, when you're trying to write about performance, and you displace the performance into a writing medium, something else happens. Some aspects of it become more clear, become more visible, quote unquote, and other aspects of it become more obscured. You know, they become more inaccessible to you as a reader. I think what would be interesting is to try this multiplicity of voices when you are writing. You know, you could have those sort of clinical, objective mode of writing when you are addressing, you know, a government institution or like, you know, a particular institution, like, you know, or when you're writing an Antrag, like, you know, you have to have that objective clinical language, a mode of address. But when you're addressing an audience, there is a particular sense of urgency that has to guide that mode of address, because audiences are not institutions and they're not expected to respond in the same way. It is really like trying to have a conversation with someone and trying to explain to them, oh, I think you should watch that performance because 1, 2, 3. I find it's a different mode of address, and it's really important to have those distinctions in mind, you know, because then the mode of address should change when you are addressing, you know, culture scientists or theater scientists or critics, then when you are addressing an audience, then when you're addressing, you know, state institutions, you know, or like a committee, like, you know, overseeing the project. They are seeing and hearing very different things. And it's important that the audience does not get lost, you know, in the middle of that very specific institutional language that, you know, that you read, especially when it comes to text on performance.
And then, but with that in mind, like how can we find ways to project to an archive, or to a, like if we talk about something like that idea of the TanzArchive in Berlin, you know, like what do we want the people in the future know about what happened, what kind of story of performance happened. And yeah, I think always like actually you have to start with something, and also with the gap of knowing that you cannot tell it truly, or that it has to have like multiple layers, and as you may say, to have counter narratives, like coming back to the beginning, and that you kind of make place for the people looking at those archives and traces and documents, that they only work if they put themselves in relation to that. And maybe that's, I don't know how it can be done, but I have the feeling what you say, like multiplicity of voices, end of documents, end of approaches. I think that could be a way, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, I had the pleasure of working with Miriam van Emschoot, who, you know, was a dance dramaturg for many years, and she's the founder of Sarma, the co-founders of Sarma, like the lab for discursive practices. And she has this platform called Oral Site, which gathers this massive documents about contemporary dance in audio form, in text. There's video snippets. And I find that this is a very interesting approach, you know, because sometimes you actually want to hear the artist speak about their work in their own terms. And sometimes you want to read about the art, how his contemporaries or her contemporaries, you know, saw the work and received the work. And sometimes you want to see the artist actually move before your eyes. And that sort of variety in media, like, you know, whether it's you hear or you see or you read, then it goes back to your point about what happens when you displace a certain practice in different mediums. Certain things then become emerge. And I think this is the same thing for the archive. If you're trying to archive, you have to really play with the medium, the format. Certain things lend themselves better to audio, for example, and other things not so much. Certain things are better seen, like, you know, or like to see a moving image of the performer, for example. I think that's really key. But I also think that there should be a particular possibility to invite people to try and then take on that score and perform it. So part of the archive should be an actual set of instructions how to perform that dance or that piece, which to me is super interesting as part of that story. Because then, let's say if there's a score for a choreography and you try to perform it, then you get to understand a lot about the dancer or the choreographer, you know, instead of just hearing them speak or seeing it. Yeah, maybe that would be also something to throw in that process.
Yeah, cool. That's a really cool idea. Yeah, and it's so true. And it goes back to that idea of embodiment in the end.
Yeah.
And that difference between a Western approach of art and of performance and of theater, and what is my job as an audience member? Like, should I just sit there very critically and then in the end have my white wine standing in the foyer and talking intelligent stuff, you know, like, is that the way? Or is it like more being move your, and yeah, in the end, move yourself in it. Yeah. Hey, Ismail, I have the feeling we talked already a lot, but how are you doing? Like, should we? I set myself a timer, and now we talked for 1 hour and 10 minutes, I guess.
Yeah.
We could, what do you think? We could do a short break and then give us another 10 minutes, or do you
Sure.
think it's done by that? But I don't want you to, yeah, I don't want to take too much of your time and energy.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's totally fine. Yeah.
So maybe we do kind of a 5 minutes break, and then we can enter again, and then whatever comes to our minds, that we keep it, because we need to archive it.
Sure.
And I actually wanted you to ask, but I don't know if you want to talk about it, because I found it so amazing what you told Agnes and me when we had that first meeting about how it's how it is actually in Egypt and in Cairo, that everything is recorded, but you don't have access to it. I'm not sure if we mentioned it, that fact so precisely in that talk. Maybe that would be a point.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, we can definitely bring that up.
And anything else that comes to your mind, or do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I would just also build on what you said, like how we're archiving right now, like because also it's a question that I'm very busy with, and how could it be also a democratic process? Like you need the experts, you need the historians, and but also how could this be? And this is a question, of course, many of us were really busy with during the revolution, because the whole idea was the voice of the people, like and how can you create archives that allow for this, for the people to speak. And those questions really endure, like even 10 years afterwards. So now when we're thinking about how to document contemporary art, we're asking the same questions. How could this be a collective sort of process? And how could it be structured in such a way that allows for this,
Yeah, that's cool. What do you think? Should we do a break, or should we just go on another 10 minutes? I don't know. How do you feel?
I mean, we can definitely just go on for 10 more minutes, I think.
Yeah, that's okay, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And just,
Yeah.
So the question would be how to, because what you clearly described in the beginning of our talk was that it is that the archive, if it's a state-holded archive, cannot be separated from power and authority.
Yes.
And how can we shift that if we have a more democratic approach to archival practice and to preserving that connection with the actual revolution and political and collective transformation process. That's super interesting.
Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, we have like one of the oldest archives probably in the world, in Africa and the Middle East. And it's quite an extensive archive, the National Archives. But increasingly, especially since the 1970s, they became heavily securitized, and you would need tons of permissions to access them, and you need to submit a full detailed proposal of what you intend to do with the information that you want to see, to have access to. So it's a very arduous process to actually get in the archive and get information out of it. Although these are very meticulous archives, they archived everything you can imagine, all the press, all the media. So that's the state archives, but also archives of TV and like, all the culture events, whether theater, dance, music, are also documented and filmed, and they are also preserved in the library and the archive on the grounds of the Cairo Opera House, actually. But then you would still need a security permission to access the material, and God forbid you want to use the material, because that would never happen. And so a lot of historians, among them, of course, is Khalid Fahmy, who's currently Professor Sultan Qaboos Chair of Arabic Studies at Cambridge. took an initiative in 2011 with the revolution to try to open the archives, to democratize the archives. And there was, again, this is the heyday of the revolution. So a lot of historians got on the bandwagon, and they went and met the head of the archives and said, we need to digitize them. This needs to be available to the public. This information belongs to the public. In parallel to those conversations Khaled and other people were having with the National Archives, there was also conversation happening on the square itself, with visual artists, journalists, photojournalists, videographers, people working in the media. They were also talking about how to actually document what is happening. And this gave birth to the idea of Tahrir archives, which would later on be transformed by the artist Lara Baladi into a very important project called Vox Populi, Voice of the People. And this is precisely it. Those collective of artists kept thinking, how do we include non-artists, non-specialists into this process of collecting and gathering material? And this happened by using footage that was taken by phones. People could just send their own footage. This happened by using footage that was actually uploaded to Facebook and other social media platforms. This happened by creating a platform where anyone can post any footage that they want. And of course, it's also a very interesting process how this got tagged and organized and but this impulse to have a collective kind of approach to documenting or archiving an event of that scale, of course, stayed with a lot of people, and especially the artists, because the artists were literally on the square. And fast forward 10 years after the revolution, at a moment where the contemporary art scene in Egypt is also facing a lot of pressure and a lot of erasure. And I'm talking about the independent alternative art scene, contemporary art scene. Now we are confronted with the same question. What do you want to archive and how do we archive it? And to me, it really has to continue in that spirit of course, artists and historians and experts should be able to have a contribution in that process, but also audiences. And that's what I would like to work on, and others, not just me, but also other artists as well. And the past few weeks, there have been a few public conversations about this. How can we begin to not just gather objects and material, but also have this multiplicity of experiences somehow find their way in that documentation process, archiving process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I bet it's a very slow process also, right? Or it takes a lot of time to, if you want to do that, how to organize it or how to build a organism that keeps itself alive, and what is the medium and what is the what is the container for that?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's also a very important question, because there is an impulse to have a digital form for it, because of course it's much more democratic and it can constantly evolve if it's a digital medium. But also there is a sense of having a physical, an actual source where you can actually see and read. And my guess is that it's going to be both. There's going to be a digital avatar of it, a digital iteration of it, and also a physical printed document. And they are different, and they serve different purposes, but I think both are important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny because it really relates to the two thoughts that like this steering group in Berlin has been busy with, like also for the past 2 years, and still, yeah. Also, when I hear you talking now, I really think I'm still with that thought that you say one has the need to archive something in the moment where you feel it might be forgotten.
Yes.
Yeah, that's I think that's really a point. If we talk about artistic archives and initiatives and how, yeah, and maybe what artistic practice is nowadays, it's a lot of archiving your own work for the sake of, yeah, you have to do it. Yeah. And how to structure it, how to make it, how to structure it, how to make a place, to build a place and an opportunity for audience and other people to enter that and to relate to that. And I really like the idea of the embodiment. Then again, yeah, I don't know. And how to create that, and who is in charge of it, how to begin and how to build it in the end. And it's sometimes I think it's also so interesting that, for instance, Berlin doesn't have an archive, but such a vivid dance history, and I feel people are working a lot with archives without having an archive. Without having like that one archive.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, that's where it needs to be a collective desire. Yes. And this is where it, if it is a collective, then it's not just about one person's idea or one person's vision of what it is or what it was. And also that the stake is much bigger. You know, it's not just one person's stake in preserving a particular work or practice, but it's the stake for everyone. Everyone has a stake in trying to sort of weave that story, you know, like the story of those practices, those experiences, really. And to me, and this is one actually major part of why archives are important. So we can critique them and all that, but archives are important because depending, of course, on the format and the approach and how you do it and how you address people with the material you have, but archives or the stories you carry, it really gives you a sense of what you are. So when I say that, you know, I've seen 20 years worth of contemporary dance in Egypt, and that has informed my understanding of what contemporary dance is. This was not just historical data. Like, this was not just me looking at images. This was actually me going to the theater, sitting, looking at those people, those artists, you know, performing and dancing and thinking and so on. That in and of itself is not just numbers on a sheet, or like, you know, in this year there were 5 performances by X, Y, and Z. The other very important sort of significant aspect of archives or stories, especially when you gather stories about performance or like, you know, a medium like dance or theater, is that they give a sense of life, you know. And to me, that is the biggest sort of challenge to try to capture that, but also the biggest threat, because then you have younger generations, and this was happening in Egypt. You have younger generations of dancers, choreographers, directors, and so on, who are interested in that practice and that medium, and then they start working, and they have no sense of self, because they don't sort of already build on that story, on those experiences. And it's, to me, a tragedy, you know, because some of the questions they are struggling with already other artists have struggled with. Some of their choices, you know, have already been thought about and worked into a practice or a piece. And that's why it's so important that they are able to have a sense of those other experiences, because, you know, those other experiences did not happen on Mars, they happen in Cairo. You know, it's not like you are trying to document something that is happening to other nation or another group of people or another like country. This happened in Egypt. And having no sense of it, to me, is really tragic. The same way that in Berlin, it is really changing over the last 10 years, and really dramatically changing, and the city is changing, and the residents and, like, you know, the demographics are changing so fast. You know, it's a shame that whoever now goes to Berlin would not have a sense of what it was like, you know, in 2002 or 3 or 4 or 5 to actually be doing something there, like, you know. So yeah, this is, I think, the other side of why that kind of practice, the archival practice, is important. It tells you something about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, looking at the archive is also looking at yourself, or looking at history is looking at yourself, because you're part of that context, and if you want or not.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, yes, I agree. And then it's interesting what speaks to you, and then there, and maybe just like one last thing, then it's not one history, it's not one archive, but it's multiple archives, multiple histories.
Yes.
But they are all there, and you are kind of like part of it, and you also formed that archive, also if you want it or not, with every action that you're doing. And maybe that's with that in mind, this reminds me maybe to make a circle. This is exactly this, or it's similar to that act of writing, like the act of looking at an archive, or to be aware that you are entering like a history spot of blind spots or gaps, maybe just better say gaps, and that this history and this approaches are changing also, and that the same document, I know you can read a book maybe 5 times, and whenever you read it, it will do something else with you. So that these archives and documents and traces, that they are also not static, but keep on affecting your presence and your future. And yeah, maybe I'm now speaking a bit too philosophically or too whatever, but yeah, you know what I mean. I had a sense of erkenntnis now when I was listening to you, and
no, definitely. I think that every time someone reads that or sees that story, that experience, you know, they become part of it, and it becomes part of them. And then, like, you know, and then it takes another life, there's a certain afterlife for that experience, and that sort of, you know, keeps evolving and changing. Absolutely. And I think this is also part of why it's exciting, because you don't know what kind of afterlife it is going to take, like what shape, what form, depending on the person, of course.
Yeah. Hey, cool. Ismail, should we leave it for now? For that, I have the feeling you were several times where I thought, oh wow, this is a great end for I mean an end for having an opportunity, if I would read that conversation, to have a starting point also again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, but we can, maybe we, if you agree on that, if you don't have to, if you have the feeling, hey, I want to say something else, we can go on, of course.
I think we more or less covered, you know, sort of more or less covered a lot of the points that that we raised. Yeah. Maybe also just one last point. About sort of, because this is I think is an interesting example when we're talking about how to archive dance or performance, and it's also linked a bit to embodiment, is transmission. And this is also, it's a very Arabic thing as well, is that part of your contribution to an archive is transmitting that to a different generation of practitioners. And this is part of archiving. So teaching someone a dance or a technique or a style is an archival practice, you know. And I think people tend to overlook that as an essential part of archiving, because if you teach 10 people a particular style of dance, or then this means that their bodies then become like, you know, reservoirs of that entire, you know, history of that practice. Yeah. And I think that is never given enough importance as, you know, like documenting, like, you know, filming, or because the act of teaching or transmission is far more intimate and intersubjective. You know, when you're teaching someone a choreography or a particular performance with the intention of seeing them perform it. I mean, not just that they mimic and, like, you know, for their own pleasure, but I mean with the intention that they should actually also perform like you. I think that's very intimate. And I think that almost encapsulates the entire experience of archiving in that particular act of transmission.
Yeah, also the idea of the responsibility. I think it's quite the same. When we the responsibility that people working in an archive feel, that they have, like, that they have to really honor the history, and that they're taking care of the things. That's why it's so much rules, and it has, like, it's yeah, it has a meaning, that whatever you preserve, but also whatever you transmit, if you truly transmit it, yeah, as you described. Yeah, it's also about trust, and about that there is something beyond singularities, maybe, that there is something that can be transmitted, like a technique.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not like, that's not me as an individual person, and if I end up doing it, then everything disappears, but that there is something that can be transmitted.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. How do you feel about us recording that?
Yeah, it's fine. I
It's
mean,
fine.
probably you're going to need me to like write down a few of the names and the people I refer to.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. You just have to remind me, like, you know.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think maybe the procedure would be that Agnes, like she will do a transcription of that, like a brief transcription, and then she will now, it's interesting, she will now like be the archive master of our talk, and has the authority to, you know, like shorten it in order to make it transmittable. So I think she will make some choices, and then come back to you. And I would tell her that whenever she doesn't get a name properly, then she can leave a gap and then can send it back to you.
Sure,
right?
of course, yes.
Yeah. When I hear you talking, then I of course also notice how limited my point of view and my experience is. But this I also this I recognize even moving to Frankfurt. I'm like, okay, I don't know the people here. I'm so much in that Berlin bubble. It's really insane. I think it's yeah, and then speaking about other contexts and about this was actually, that was the question I had for you, but poor Agnes, I mean, she has to watch 2 hours of us talking. Just what you think about canon and how a canon is built, and how it's maybe, I don't know, do you have one thought about that?
I mean, that's a very big question.
I know.
It's a very big question.
I know.
It's very hard to think about canons without thinking about, again, authority. Like, you know, who defines a canon, what gets included in a canon, what gets excluded from the canon. So there's that sort of immediate reaction to when we think about canons, and therefore we cannot think about canons in the context of performing arts or theater or dance without thinking about the Western canon, because then it becomes very clear that modern and contemporary dance in the Western definition have very particular histories, you know, like Laban, Mary Wigman, Martha Graham, like Doris Humphrey, like, you know, very clear reference points, very clear timeline. And contemporary dance, the same thing, like, you know, postmodern dance, Judson Church, Crowd, you know, Trisha Brown, Lisa Nelson, Steve Paxton, and so on. So that's a very specific set of reference points and like outlines. It's like an outline through which you can see a particular practice. Of course, anyone who learned or wanted to learn contemporary dance or modern dance had to, whether they're Egyptian or Lebanese or from Ouagadougou or anywhere in, like, you know, in Africa or the Middle East or even Southeast Asia, they had to study that. Some went to Graham School, some went to Parts, some went to SNDO, and so on. What does that mean? It means that there is a constant question once they go back to their context, whether it's Mumbai, Beirut, Cairo, Casablanca. What does it mean to then carry that particular tradition of movement, of choreography, those references, those aesthetics that are very specific? And that's another big question about canons. Is it really universal? Does it translate? You know, so audience in Morocco or in Egypt or in India or Pakistan, when they watch Anna Teresa de Keersmaeker, when they watch even Pina Bausch, what do they understand? What do they get? How does that speak to their own experience of body and dance and so on, and the definitions also of what dance is? Now, that's a very big contested issue for many dancers in the region and, Southeast Asia and North Africa. It's a very big question because those regions have already traditions of dance and movement, some were definitely influenced by modern dance and ballet and ballroom dancing and Broadway and musicals, and I just sent an email to my showing her one of those examples of modernist interpretation of belly dance and folkloric dance that took place in the 60s after independence. So there is definitely mutual influence, and I'm not so naive to say, no, our practices are completely isolated or native. No, they're not. And especially dance and music are two forms that are very open to influence, incredibly porous, very porous. So there is this issue that you do have a particular set of traditions that developed in response to that foreign influence, that so-called Western foreign influence, and it did change a lot of it, and even belly dance changed dramatically 19th century onwards. And you do have traditions that evolved, but did not evolve in the same way that, postmodern dance did or post-dramatic theater did. And that's one of the main, I think, points of tension when you talk about canons, because then the references that people in the region, for example, still find very relevant are completely out of fashion in Europe, for example. Many theater makers in Egypt still find absurd theater, especially of the 1960s and 50s, very relevant to their reality, for example. Very relevant. UNESCO and the whole crowd, that's the #1 reference. Why? Because it speaks to a very specific social and political reality. My problem is that when Western curators or dramaturgs or directors come to Egypt or to Lebanon or Syria, or what used to be Syria, or go to Morocco or Tunisia, they always have the same comment: this is so old-fashioned, this is so passé, this is so uninteresting. And to me, that is not just ignorant and incredibly condescending. It shows complete lack of understanding as what translates, what gets to pass over those different cultural barriers, historical barriers, and what really, to go back to what you said about Rebecca Schneider, what remains in people's consciousness and people's sort of, imagination, the imaginary, that collective imaginary that really holds on to certain aspects or references of the canon, because it makes sense to them. It makes sense to this audience to hold on to Martha Graham. We can try and study that, why this happens, why particular references make sense and others don't. But then, when you start to exclude those references from the canon, the so-called universal canon, which is always the Western canon, that's the problem for me. Because who said that, Samia Gamer, the Egyptian ballet dancer, is not as influential as Martha Graham when she started incorporating ballet diagonal movements in belly dance? That was a revolution, really a true revolution. Everyone after Samia Gamer owes her a debt because she broke into space, which is completely the antithesis of belly dance. This woman redefined belly dance single-handedly. So why is this not in the canon, for example? And then if you do actually then refer to Samia Gamer as a point for you and the canon. They say, who the fuck is this? You know, why is this important? Why is this important? And then you have to explain that this is important because it's the first time someone breaks into space diagonally, and belly dance is very centered, very limited, sort of, you know, you don't break into space and so on. That exclusion, one, lack of interest, two, but also the burden of constantly having to defend your choices vis-a-vis what's in the canon, I find is not just tedious, but very, very disheartening. Like, you know, you constantly are fighting to be in conversation with the canon, like, you know, and it's not like people are curious. Like when I say Samia Gamal or Naima Akif, it's not like, who is that? We'd like to know the practice more, or why this person is a reference. There is no curiosity, which is a huge problem, because you know, it's, again, going to your point, it's a very asymmetrical relationship. So I have to know everything about Western dance and performance by heart, inside out. Have to see tons of, like, you know, performances and be very fluent in that language. And then when I talk about my own practice, my own history of practice, if I mention any of those names, with the exception of people who know the practice or actually were involved in it, no one would know, and no one is interested to know. So
yeah,
yeah,
nothing to add.